Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream event on the 22nd of August 2023. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics here. Great to have you on tonight. And we're going to talk about property and related issues. There's a lot going on. I said to Veronica in the conversation just now before we came on air that there's some really weird indicators going on, so I'm not quite sure what the property market's doing. So we'll try and unpick some of those things. As normal, I'll just remind you that we're not providing specific property or legal or financial advice. It's a general conversation only. We do moderate the chat, but feel free to put your thoughts and suggestions in. If you've got a particular question, use that Walk the World to get my attention. And that means that you come to the top of my queue, which means that I've got more chance of seeing you. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means that if you would want to get your question to the top of the list, you can use Super Chat to do that, or indeed make a contribution to what we do here. There we go. Anyway, let's bring Veronica in. Veronica, hello.
Hello, nice to see you again.
Indeed. From one side of the world to the other, but it could be just down the road, really.
Well, it could be. And in fact, if we did it a couple of weeks ago, it would have been just down the road almost. But I was on your side of the world. I love all your wires, I have to say. I've often wondered how you set up your studio, and you just showed us. And I'm like, oh, my God, I think I'll just stick to my no studio with very few wires.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, I've got a few control systems here because I'm running everything myself. And so the whole design of the studio is to make it, a one-person operation. And that's the good news is it sort of works at the moment. I've pretty much got the same systems as I had. I brought it all over, but I've got a bigger studio this time, so it's sort of more laid out and designed from the bottom up. I had to make a huge hole through my wall to be able to put the servers and things the other side of the wall, so it was actually quiet in here. But anyway, that's another story.
So it's humming, not humming.
Exactly. Anyway, let's talk about the property market. Is the property market humming or is it not humming? It's a really weird situation at the moment. So much contradictory indication.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly humming in Sydney anyway. And it does certainly it's defying expectations, but it's not humming everywhere in Australia at the moment, as distinct from 2021, that crazy market where everything was pointing upwards. It's not doing that. So there's a bit of normality, I think, returning to some parts of the market.
Normality is being restored. Everything else is your own problem.
What is normal, of course.
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yes.
As they turn the improbability drive down a bit.
I must read that again. I really must.
I'll tell you, I the first time it came out on the radio years and years ago, I thought it was hilarious, and it always was worth reading again because there are so many wonderful quotes that you can throw into a conversation. But look, I still continue my one-to-one conversations, and I can tell you that there are some very, very important themes coming out from there. And maybe what we'll do is tease out some of those little thematics as we go along. But one of the things that's really come up in the last 2 or 3 months in particular, as interest rates have gone up, are these first-time buyers, the aspiring first-time buyers, who are seeing the borrowing power dropping, who are seeing property prices not falling anything like what many people, including myself, expected. Rents going up. So the thought of, maybe I should just buy anything, never mind whether it's in the right area, never mind if it's in good quality. Should I just buy something and get in the market? Now, if you're a first-time buyer with a bit of money saved up, what's your thoughts there? I have to say my immediate reaction was be careful because there is still good property and there's still bad property. That rule hasn't changed. But I guess you can probably empathise with the idea of, if I get out of rental into owning a property, at least I don't have the same issue about rising rents.
Well, yeah. And there's definite, substance to the thought that, look, I just have to get on the property ladder at any case, at any cost. And I swear, Martin, with all your technology, have you got a camera looking at what I was working on my computer just before we came on air? Because literally I'm putting together a script for a podcast I'm recording tomorrow with Megan Wells, who's my co-host, on your First Home Buyer Guide podcast about exactly that. It's a bad advice series, and the piece of advice that we're tackling tomorrow is I should just get on the property market at any cost, just get anything, just buy, just get there. And it is, there's some truth in that as an approach, but with absolute caution, as you've mentioned there, because the problem is that quite often people, when they're feeling panicked and pressured, they don't actually open their eyes up and look properly at all the options available to them, and they compromise on the wrong things. And a couple of things that you can make a big mistake there. One is if you buy something that you are going to outgrow really fast. And I made this mistake when I bought my first property, not for the same reasons, but just for different reasons. But I made the mistake. I bought something that was way too small. I potentially could have afforded more. I never even explored what the other options were. And it felt safe because it was small and didn't feel very risky, but it was way riskier because actually I outgrew it within a year. And then I had to face selling costs and additional costs to buy something else. And I partnered up, and at least I had more money available. But the reality was I could have potentially looked at buying a better property, potentially even afforded a better property, maybe even waited a little bit, and actually had more options down the track. So I closed off my own options because I just didn't explore other options. And I know that when people are under pressure, then you don't believe there are as many options as you really do. And if you buy the wrong property, or if you buy the sort of property that is not scarce, that is easy to buy, such as a cookie cutter apartment or a house and land package with heaps of them, then you run the risk of buying a property that doesn't really go up in value. And sometimes they don't go up in value for a very long time. So this idea of avoiding being in the rental market, I totally get, especially when we've got this chronic shortage and rents are going up at record rates. And also you've got a situation where property prices are going up faster than you can save, and certainly faster than inversely when prices hang on, let me start again. When prices fell last year, they didn't fall as fast as borrowing capacities fell. As you were just saying, and borrowing capacities are down like 40% because of the interest rate rises here. And, and prices, despite some of your doom and gloom predictions, Martin, the property market in Australia has not yet fallen 40%. So it's one of those magic numbers that seems to come up all the time. And so, of course, a first home buyer is feeling under pressure there, because you're thinking, oh, my God, I just got to panic and buy anything. So that's the worst thing. Now, you probably do have to shave a hell of a lot off your expectations. And maybe you have to be thinking smaller, and maybe you have to be thinking a different location, and maybe you consider rent vesting versus buying to live in, depending on your circumstances. To me, that's a low down on the list of options, to be quite frank. Maybe you do need to consider a lot of different options, but I think panicking and jumping in, just buying anything is fraught with danger, because you might get stuck with that just buy anything. And if you don't buy a good asset, you could get stuck on that rung of the ladder forever.
Yeah, I think that's good advice, Veronica. And, just grabbing the first thing that comes by is really, really risky, partly because a lot of the property that's coming on the market and being listed are actually old investment properties. The reason that they're now being listed is because they're not necessarily very high quality properties that haven't been that well maintained. And yet, of course, people want to get top dollar if they're trying to sort of exit the investment sector. And I know that the other thing to observe is that listings have come up a little in some areas, not universally so. So the thought is there's probably going to be a little bit more property coming on over the next few weeks and months as some of these interest rates bite and other things. So in a way, you might actually be picking the wrong point from a supply side, because a lot of the stuff that's around, well, it's been around for quite some time and is not necessarily particularly attractive property, which comes then back to, do you buy a dog? And if it's still a dog, is it still a dog even in this market?
A dog is always a dog. It's just that in a hot market, a dog for a moment doesn't look like a dog, but underneath it's still a dog. I call it sort of chocolate covered dog food. In fact, that somebody offers you a plate of kale, it's really healthy. They offered you a chocolate covered ball, and you think that couldn't have dog food on the inside of it. but sometimes, but people go for what looks good on the outside, but they want to disregard what's on the inside sometimes. I probably needed to explain that analogy a bit better, but I've got videos on it if anyone wants to go digging through my YouTube. So the thing is with a lot of investors coming onto the market, and it's interesting because CoreLogic came out with some press releases around this when they released their last pain and gain report, and it's one of my favorite reports, the pain and gain report. And I haven't yet interviewed Eliza Owen for the Elephant in the Room podcast, but we are interviewing her, I think, next week. So I want to sort of really get into sort of more of a breakdown of the types of investors that have been selling, and listings are up. Yes, in July, national listings just a sliver under the 5-year average, and which is interesting because July is winter here in Australia, and it's an unusual month to have an uplift in listings like that, because normally winter is quite low on the listings side of things. But total listings are still down, significantly down on averages, and so the whole market, the property market is made up of what's available for sale, is made up of new stuff coming onto the market, added onto the pile of stuff that hasn't yet sold. And when the market's really slow, that pile that hasn't yet sold it swells, and the stuff that's old and stale, that swells as well. When the market's hot, that stuff churns pretty quickly, the days on market reduces, and there's obviously less total listings. So even though new listings are up, total listings are still down. And, where I track clearance rates, auction clearance rates, and auction listings, so new listings plus withdrawn rates in Sydney, we've seen certainly in the last 6 weeks, there's been a steep increase in new listings in Sydney. In fact, CoreLogic have come out and said, I think it's 10.4% increase, which is leading the country, really. I think Hobart's got an increase, but, that's a different story. So despite the fact we've got that sharp increase, the market is holding up very, very well. Buyers are still, it's still in a seller's market. The clearance rate's still over 70%. So yeah, there's more stock coming on the market, but it's being snapped up. And a lot of those investors, yes, they were selling crap, that basically taking the advantage of getting out after probably years of, well, some of them, not all, but years of really poor returns. And I'm not talking about yield here, I'm talking about capital growth. After 2021, a lot of people took the opportunity and said, you know what, finally had some growth, I'm getting out of here. So I think that sort of stock, and that's what you've got to be careful about buying, picking up that sort of stock. And a lot of investors like to approach the market thinking they want to buy a bargain, and you buy a bargain, you're looking for that type of stock. It's not great, it doesn't perform that well.
No, that's right. And again, some of my conversations with property investors, they always shed the less well-performing property and keep the ones that are actually doing better, which is not surprising.
Well, actually, sometimes, right?
Right.
Because there is this thing called loss aversion, right? It's a behavioral bias. And I've known plenty of investors that have actually done the opposite of that. They've sold the property, they sold the golden goose, they sold the one that actually has made them the most amount of money, and they've kept the dogs because they think, oh, it'll come good eventually. So someone who's a bit savvy will get rid of the bad stuff. Someone who's not so savvy will keep the bad stuff, hoping that it's going to turn into a golden goose. But we all know it won't. My metaphors are terrible tonight, but anyway, I think you know what I mean.
Yeah, golden geese and dogs and etc. Yeah, no, that's right. But the point is that sometimes people make non-rational decisions when you look at it objectively from the outside. But from where they are, they feel as though it's a perfectly rational decision. And I find that fascinating because it comes back to psychology. And I think there is a lot of psychology, hopium, and a few other things whizzing around in the middle of this. In other words, the hopium. You've heard of hopium?
Love it. Yeah. No, but I love it. Yeah, it's great. I just call it wishful thinking, but hopium is way better.
Yeah, exactly right. And so sometimes when you actually, and again, in my one-to-ones, I find this, I sort of push a little bit at the underlying logic behind the decisions that they're taking and why they're taking them. It's quite interesting because sometimes the penny drops But sometimes the penny never drops. They still are wedded to their particular view of the world and their particular philosophy. And so I find that the psychological aspects and, you know, the sort of the societal issues actually quite often come to the fore more than the economics, or in fact more than the logic.
Well, that's one of these days I'm going to write a book about flawed thinking around property and you know, the whole behavioral aspect of it, because, and this is something a lot of forecasters miss. They don't understand that, you know, people making decisions is basically what leads to whatever happens in the property market, right? So, you know, you've got to understand people's behavior and how people respond and react to what's going on in the marketplace. And one of the things that I suspect is happening is that with our shorter news cycle and also the way in which we're getting our information delivered faster and faster, particularly with, you know, ready access to AI now, everybody's got it, that we are reacting faster and being very short term as a species. I think short termism is on the rise. It's my theory. I've got no actual hard evidence on any of this. Is a hypothesis, so I'll need to do some research. But I'm seeing that, and you're talking about erratic data, you know, or data patterns that aren't sort of making sense anymore. And I think this is because this sort of stuff is coming out in the way that we're all reacting to, you know, interest rate rises, inflation, cost of living, media, you know, consumer confidence, and what that's responding to. You know what I mean? I just think that there's a lot of drivers that are causing this flawed thinking and causing these sort of fallacies, and then people are acting on them and being totally unconscious to the fact that we're all just being tossed around by our emotions. So very unformed theory on that, but I'm working on it.
Yeah, well, I do think behavioural economics, which is what we're broadly talking about here, it is a poorly understood, you know, factor, not only in property, by the way, but also in financial markets too. So, I mean, if you look at what's happening in the financial markets over the last 2 or 3 months, you know, basically the herd went one way saying, oh, it's all going to be doom and gloom, everything's going to fall and, you know, it's going to be into recession. And then, no, everything's going to be fine. We're going to have a perfect soft landing. And now we've got the situation where interest rates are rising much faster than people expected, particularly in the bond market. And so again, what you're seeing is you're seeing almost herd-like instincts, right? And it's nothing to do with the fundamental numbers. It's all to do with the herd. And I actually have to say, I think in property, the herd and, you know, where people are going, you know, call them lemmings or call them a herd, whatever you want to mix my metaphors. It's important to understand that. You can actually get swept up. And I'd also say I agree with you that it's being overemphasized by the social media and by all of the mechanisms. You know, even the major portals have very strong social media presences. They're also, of course, being on the mainstream media a lot, so that their opinions and thoughts are being amplified through other media channels too. So in a way, there's a lot of stuff coming from all directions. And I sometimes say to people in my one-to-ones, got to separate the sheep from the goats in terms of the information, right? Because not all information is equally valuable. And that's a problem. Exactly.
I'm just scrolling through some notes. I've been reading this book called Think Again by a guy named Adam Grant. And I just was scrolling through my notes because he's published in this book this cartoon with permission. He published it, and it's basically got a queue up of people. And I'm trying to find it so I can remember what the signs say. But one sign says, you know, like the convenient sort of, you know, the easy route basically, and the other one's the inconvenient truth. And of course, everyone's lining up to go down the easy route, and there's very few people wanting to go down the inconvenient truth bit. And obviously the property market is ripe for a lot of misinformation because there's a lot of money to be made by selling a system or selling an idea to people who really want an easy way to make money. You know, I'm not sure if I'm going quite off topic here. Was it right on topic? I don't know. But, you know, so convenient messages that aren't very well, they're very well thought out in the sense they're a sales pitch, but they're not really well thought out in terms of are they really true or not. Convenient messages sell, you know, like your message isn't anywhere near as convenient. It's an inconvenient truth. My message is an inconvenient truth. I don't have anywhere near the following that people who are peddling the wishful thinking, the hopium, the hopium traders. I'm not a hopium trader, and unfortunately, though, people love hopium and they love it much more than inconvenient truths, right? So it's the plate of kale versus the chocolate covered dog food, right? And people, we're our own worst enemies. We line up for this shit. We pay for it. Give me more bullshit, please. I don't want to hear that one. It's not as attractive.
Well, and going back to my 40%, right? So just to be clear, the 40% argument is if you go back to long-term trends and look at income ratios to prices, to get back, either incomes have got to grow another 40%, highly unlikely, or prices have got to come back to that long-term trend. That's the logic as to why ultimately we're still in the bubble. Now, there's a bunch of reasons why we're in it. Yeah, go on.
Except there's too many vested interests, right? That it's already set up. It ain't going backwards, right? Yep. And this is, there's actually a new. We interviewed Evan Thornley from Longview on the podcast, and he gave this sort of great rundown about the different generations of first home buyers since World War II in Australia, and how, in fact, it's become possible for each generation to buy. And the latest iteration, so last lot was, two income family, basically, right? And before that was one income family would. And then before that, you had to have a really big deposit, and they reduced the amount of deposit and introduced LMI. And so they, the institutions, if you like, banks, governments, whatever, come up with ways in which that it's to enable people to borrow the money to buy the houses. And now in this next iteration of this, because you can't, now you've got two incomes in the house. How many more incomes can you get, right? You can't put your kids out to work. How many jobs can you get? You might need a second job at the moment to pay the mortgage, but, not long term. So the next iteration is this an equity stake. So some governments, the state, I think Victorian government has come out with a sort of an equity stake to help first home buyers, and Longview's trying to come out with its own product on that. And so this is the next way to lever people into the property market. So that's why your 40% will never come off, Martin, because there will always be someone willing to get in there to orchestrate and be the architect of the new way to help first home buyers, the next generation of first home buyers into the property market.
Except, of course, that with interest rates rising, the chances of people able to survive in that environment is getting less and less easy. And the shared equity stuff, which, of course, the UK tried 4 or 5 years ago, didn't go so well. So we've got a lot of people who are now in properties that they own a bit of, but they can't necessarily easily get out of it.
Well, that's another issue, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
and this is why it's so important for people to really think long term when they're buying their first home. And, they have to be, if they're going to be taking on a shareholder like that, they have to be really confident that that is a property that's going to serve them for a very long time.
And actually, if you do the calculations with interest rates rising, you have to take even the longer term view, right? Because effectively, if you look at the way the economics works with interest rates rising, that's going to mean more of your income is going to have to go to servicing the interest on the mortgage, whatever it is, for longer. And that means that if you do the modelling, you've got to actually think longer rather than shorter. And I still think that people haven't fully woken up to the idea that maybe these interest rates that we're seeing are not a temporary rise and it's going to come back down to rock bottom again. Maybe this is actually a reversion to a more normal rate of interest. In other words, this 5, 6 and 7% mortgage rates is more where things have been. If you look over the last 50, 60, 80 years, that's more where it's been. So in fact, the aberration was the ultra low rates, and that was driven by central banks dropping rates to zero, all the government stimulus and everything else. So if that's true, then the economics shift back. And so I sort of agree, and I had Evan on my show, some time back, and we spoke about some of these alternative dynamics. But if interest rates are going to be as high now and stay high, that does put a fundamentally different lens over which property decisions have to be taken.
Look, it's true, but And you can, I'm sure that you'll throw a spanner into this logic, but we've had higher rates before and we've had increasing prices, you know? So, I don't really understand. And it doesn't make sense, like I remember when I bought my first house, it was, I think, what was it, 421,000 or something. And I thought, oh, that is such a ridiculous amount of money. That house is never going to be worth $1 million, And, I think it's worth about 2 million now. I don't own it anymore, but, and you never think it's going to go up, right? You can't imagine that it's going to go up that level. And so, and I think back to when interest rates were like 7 and 8% in Australia, and I had my business then, and I was buying property then, and my clients were buying property then. So I get that, you're combining higher interest rates with higher purchasing prices now, and obviously higher borrowing. But I'm not sure just because they're going to stay high, and they're obviously going to stay at a higher level than they certainly were before. I mean, but I don't know that necessarily means it's going to peter out. I don't think this is a train that has a terminus,
Well, that means
there's a lot of track.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking of the old Thunderbirds. I don't know whether you remember Thunderbirds, but a long time ago, it was these puppets, and there was a very good episode where they had a monorail going faster and faster and faster and faster and faster, and they tried all sorts of things to try and stop this train, and I think it crashed. So the point is this a one-way journey where effectively
to oblivion?
Well, where does it end up? The $1 million plus $2 million plus $5 million plus apartment in the centre of Sydney.
Well, yes, it actually does. I mean, that's the value of money falls, and that's what happens. I mean, but you could say, where does it end up? I'm not sure the planet's still going to be here in 100 years the way we're going. So you could take the whole thing's on a railroad to oblivion. So that's probably a topic for a different. And I'm an optimist, by the way. I'm an optimist, but yeah. We humans are pretty stupid species, really.
Well, we do seem to be chopping off our nose despite our face on so many fronts. And what I find interesting is the economic reality, right? So currently we've got more people with bigger mortgages, and therefore they're having to pay more of their overall income into getting somewhere to live, and that's either renting or buying a property, which means they've got less disposable income to do other things. Now, some are fine, but a lot aren't. And that's having an economic...
It's great for reducing inflation.
Well, that's the point. Yeah, exactly. So actually high house prices could actually be disinflationary because it actually reduces the ability to be able to actually buy other things. Now, there's an interesting thought.
Yeah. Look, it does concern me, actually. I mean, I talk about rising prices, and there was a comment there, why do prices have to always rise? Why is that a good thing? You could look at I have the same question around economic growth. Why do we have to have economic growth? Why is that always a good thing? We're ruining the planet with our economic growth. The only thing that grows unbridled is cancer. It's not a good thing, right? So, a tree grows and it gets to a certain point and it stops growing. I think I'm not a climate change, I'm not even a scientist, as I think it's quite obvious from the way I talk. The point I'm trying to make here, though, is that I don't think it's good for society that prices keep rising and the inequity gap keeps widening. I don't think it is. And I think that in a way that's sort of going to, think back to the French Revolution. You know what I mean? I think rising inequity is bad for society. So I think structurally, as a Western society, if we don't start really thinking very differently about how we all live and how we all prosper, then we're going to have a problem. And in the pure property sense of this, we look at where our people who lower income people that or lower income earners that help our cities thrive, if they have to commute 4 hours a day, that's not a good thing for any city either. You know what I mean? So we've got some really structural, systemic things that we need to be looking at. And I'm not sure any government really has the appetite to properly take that bull by the horns. I don't know. So if it's not dealt with, then I just think that our lives, our cities aren't going to be as good. It's going to impact our property prices in one way or another. I think we're better to take the bull by the horns and address this sort of thing now, but I'm not sure we will.
No, politically, it's not a very palatable thing to need to, and of course, often these things are over a longer term than the election cycle. And I guess you could look at the recent announcements on housing, right, and the massive amount of coverage it got on all the announceables, which actually are almost worth, well, not much at all, really, in terms of the size of the quantum that is really required to deal with the problem we've got. And that's partly high migration, it's partly interest rates, partly no social housing being, so there are a bunch of big picture issues, but they're too hard. So they sort of skate round the edge and then do the sort of the simpler things that actually don't really have a lot of impact but sound good.
Well, to be honest, I thought the federal government's announcement was more promising and encouraging than I sort of expected. In fact, when you look at it, I looked at a chart only yesterday which showed the sharp decrease in government spending in public housing since 1955. And that responsibility has then been passed on to the individual investors in this country. And now the investors have really been thrown under the bus as being, dirty investors, dirty landlords, blah, blah, blah. And look, I'm sure I know there are some pretty crap landlords out there, don't get me wrong. And this idea that we're just putting up rents because our costs have gone up, it never works that way. We put up rents if we can. We also are forced to drop them if we have to as well. That's a free market, right? In fact, I've got 2 properties and the rents have only just returned to what they were before COVID. So yes, there's been sharp rental increase, but there's no talk about it. There's no, those poor investors when they had to take a hit through COVID. So, but our governments have basically left this well and truly in the hands of individual investors, and now it's very convenient to let us come off looking like the bad guys, And so the Greens come out stomping on their feet, going on and on about rent freezes and how you got to look after tenants' rights and all the rest of it. And I'm not saying that tenants should not have rights and should not be looked after. They absolutely should. It's a fundamental human right to have a safe, roof over your head. But I think politically, it's not being handled honestly in this country. And I think, too, the future of investment is going to be interesting because with increased investment from governments or by governments in the public housing space, and also with the growing build-to-rent sector, the opportunity for individual investors to I guess, prosper in the way they have in recent decades may not be quite as lucrative, shall we say. So I'm just sort of starting to think about that. You might have some thoughts on that, Martin.
Of course. Well, it's very interesting.
Of course.
So, I've had the opportunity of analysing quite a few portfolios of investment properties for people. And the first observation is quite a few people haven't got a full sense of what all the inputs and outputs in terms of money in, money out were. They sort of conveniently forget what they had to pay by way of stamp duty on the way in, the maintenance costs and all those things, right? So the cash flow elements of investing is quite often not fully understood. And then what you do is you overlay the prospect of capital appreciation. And of course, for many people, it's the capital appreciation that actually is the big attractor. And sure, there's been some very good times when property prices have actually accelerated dramatically, and so those investment properties have done very well from a capital appreciation. But when you've held that property for 6, 8, 10 years, right, and you actually look at the journey of appreciation over that time, it's extremely lumpy, right? So there were times when it did well, times when it did less well. And then it's a question of, well, how do you actually take that lumpiness and spread it back over the journey of the property? And if you start doing that, then you end up with some rather troubling numbers, which suggest that actually overall, many property investors don't really make anything other than the rate of inflation over the whole life of the property. And that's actually, if you are making inflation, you're doing quite well, because there's a lot who actually are doing a lot worse than that. And then if you tease it apart and say, well, what types of property are actually doing better versus not? And is it region by region. The truth is, it's a real patchwork. So there are some where investment returns are actually pretty good and sustainable, and it's all very good. But there are other areas, some regional areas, for example, where over that period of ownership, the value's actually gone backwards through some of it too. So net, they're actually underwater. Now, that's the sort of conversation that not many property investors want to hear. So, they prefer the other story about, it'll be fine, the property prices are going to go up again, so we'll hold on a bit longer. But then you ask the question, well, okay, how much does it have to go up? Over what time period to enable you to actually turn your return positive? And that's quite a troubling answer, because the answer is a significant acceleration over a relatively 2 or 3 year period. In other words, like we had through COVID and beyond, when interest rates were cut to 0.1%, and when the government threw money through home builder like you wouldn't believe, and all those other incentives. And then the question is, are they going to do that again? Because if they're not, maybe we're not going to see that sort of dramatic surge higher, which means that many of those investment properties will never actually cover their total cost over that time of ownership. And that's troubling.
So a lot of investors, most people don't know how to benchmark their property performance. And so many times I have people say to me, I've done really well in property. And so that's excellent. I'm very, very happy for you. Tell me, what does that mean? Oh, well, I made money. Like, I bought it for this and now it's worth that. I won't even get into how do you know it's worth that? But anyway, and it's more like, well, that's great. What about your costs? But also, how have you benchmarked that? What do you mean benchmark? Well, how have you assessed whether that's a good return or not? But it went up. And these are smart people that talk to me like that. It's like the first time it's ever dawned on them. And I'm like, well, because, okay, you could compare it with the suburb itself, which is definitely a valid way of doing it. But that's assuming that you've chosen a good suburb in the first place, right? So if you're not really certain about the suburb or the location, you need to then benchmark that against a bigger market. So potentially you could say, right, well, I've got this one property and it's gone up X percent over however many years. The Sydney median has gone up Y percent. Is that more or less than my X percent? That's one way of doing it. But also, what people need to understand is that you can choose a great location to invest in, and then you can choose a dog of a property. I've often used, particularly if anyone listens to the Elephant in the Room podcast, they'll hear me often referring to Balmain. It's just because that's where I have an office and I know that market intimately. So in Balmain, it's like the cherry on the top of the inner west cake in Sydney, right? It's a very desirable suburb. It's aspirational. People want to be there. It's got all those lovely foundations of, that would underpin capital growth or suggest it's going to be a good performing suburb. And yet I know people have actually lost money owning property in Balmain, because they chose the wrong asset. And if you don't know how to choose the right asset, you can choose the best, you can pick the next hotspot. But if you don't know how to choose the right asset in that hotspot, you can still lose money. And all the data people, this comes back to that, the nuance of data and the chocolate coated dog food. The data experts that don't understand, but they know that people feel safe with data, and they package something up, and you can lie with statistics, and they sell a dream that all you need to do is follow this lovely little, this little method that I followed, and look at all my squillions. And it's crap, because these people don't get to know a suburb or an area intimately enough to understand what represents a good property in that area, and then to be able to identify that property, an A-grade property, price it accordingly, negotiate. They just don't know how to do that bit. But that doesn't matter, because you got all the data. Data makes me feel safe. So a lot of investors buy purely on data and make the fundamental mistake of choosing crap assets. And sometimes people think that it's the price. They say, I hear this a lot, you make money when you buy. And they're thinking that's the price you pay, if you get it at a good enough bargain. But the reality is you make money by what you buy. Yes, when you buy it, yes, because that's when you're choosing what to buy. But what you buy actually determines whether you're going to make money in property or not.
Yes, absolutely. And not all properties are the same. Not all locations are the same. And I think that some of these aggregate averages that are being reported in terms of property prices went up X percent in Sydney, right? I mean, that's such a stupid number as to be completely meaningless, right? And yet that's the thing gets reported, that gets, in all, see it on ABC, you see it on all the mainstream media, you see it on all the property portals, everybody sort of quotes it as if it was meaningful. It's completely meaningless, right? Within that number,
it's well, it only works if you're comparing it against the same number from a year ago or a year before that, right? It's a relativity score. It doesn't mean my house went up that much. It certainly doesn't mean the house next door went up that much. It's a very small percentage of properties that actually goes up exactly what the median went up. As in, it's the midpoint. So 50% of properties will do better than and 50% do worse than.
Oh, heresy. You mean not all properties go up equally? Well, that's an interesting observation.
Well, weirdly enough, when I was a sales agent, so before I became a buyer's agent and put my critical thinking skills to good use, I swallowed that line for a bit. Oh, yeah, well, all property goes up in value the same. So if you buy it cheap, it doesn't matter, It's like, even then it's wrong because it's like exponential. Like if it's a proportion of a smaller amount of money is going to end up with less money in your pocket. But anyway, that's beside the point. Yeah, so it was one of the fallacies that I worked that out very quickly when I became a buyer's agent. And I started doing case studies and I started tracking. Why did that one make heaps of money over the same period and that one lost money or made a small amount of money? Why? And that started my whole analysis of actual property selection and the characteristics that make up an A-grade property. Just pure observation.
Absolutely. And the more people understand that there is a set of logic underlying, the top level story that you've got to get to understand if you're going to make good property investments, whether you're an investor or whether you're for own occupation. And there's a bit of a debate, is property for somewhere to live, or is it actually an asset class that provides an investment return? And I find that quite often those two agendas get scrambled in people's minds. So if you're buying for own occupation, probably the primary lens should be, is it in the right area for you from a lifestyle point of view, et cetera, right? Whereas if you're buying it from an investment point of view, maybe you ask a different set of questions. But I quite often see that those two get scrambled up in people's minds. And so then they say, I need to buy somewhere that meets all my owner-occupier requirements, but I also want to make sure that it actually does well as an investment. And maybe sometimes those two things pull in different directions.
Well, I actually, a slightly different way of encouraging our clients to think about this. I say an investor needs to think like an owner-occupier, right? Not like they are going to be the owner-occupier, but somebody else, the demographic, this type of person that would want to aspire to live in that property. And the reason that an investor has to think about things as an owner-occupier is because fundamentally owner-occupiers are the people that push up prices. Now, I know that as a market, if there's lots of investors in it, they can fuel the fire and push up prices. But an individual property, that the people that will compete the hardest on an individual property are owner-occupiers, not investors. So you get to an auction, it's not often you see an investor, maybe they might outbid owner-occupiers, first home buyers, but if everyone had the same amount of money, if everyone had the same budget, the owner-occupier will outbid the investor on a property that appeals to owner-occupiers. And so you want a property with owner-occupier appeal, because you want to have that fueling its growth. Because, when you go to sell, you want those people fighting for your property, right? But that's not your owner-occupier lens. That's the market owner-occupier lens, if you like. And I also encourage owner-occupiers to think like investors. If you think like an investor, yes, you're going to choose to live in a location that works for you and a location and a type of property that works for you and your family, right? So that's good. But by viewing it with an investor lens, you're also thinking, is this the sort of property that people will compete for down the track? Or is this so unique to my needs that I'm the only mug that's going to really want it? And if that's the case, fine. but be very, very aware of that and negotiate accordingly and pay accordingly, But I do think that particularly with first home buyers have to think with an investor lens, because that first home is unlikely going to be your forever home. And so if you don't buy that with a sort of investor lens, thinking about your next buyer, who is going to buy that when you go to sell and upgrade, then you potentially be leaving money on the table. You really do have to be thinking, I want a property that's going to be popular. It's going to be competitive when I sell it. And that's why you have to be thinking, both the owner occupiers that potentially will fight for it, but as an investor, you're thinking about what job is this property got to do for me to help me with my financial journey through life. So that's what I would counsel, particularly first home buyers.
I think that's very good advice, because you're right. First time buyer means getting into the market. It doesn't mean it's the place you're going to live in for the next 20, 30, 40 years, right? Almost certainly, family coming along and other things will require you to move again, which means implicitly there needs to be a certain degree of liquidity in the property that you're actually buying, because liquidity means that you can sell it again when you need to sell it, and hopefully with some growth in value. Whereas if you buy something which is one of those dogs, it might be a bit cheaper, but the chances of other people wanting to buy it at a price that's reasonable probably is not very high. And I'm afraid I've seen some really, really bad case studies over the last few months of people buying the wrong property because it's all they could afford, right?
Yes.
Borrowing power down. How do you square that circle?
Well, so the way to square that circle, and it's yuck. It's a shit sandwich. You just got to choose your bread, right? You're going to eat a shit sandwich. The way to square that circle is that if you buy a piece of crap, right, on a main road, I hate main roads, right? Don't ever buy on a main road, right? Don't do it. But people will do it because they think, oh, okay, it's my only way to buy in a suburb I really want to be in. Now, I get it. Some people cannot get their head around moving to a different suburb, so they'll do it, right? But I would always advise them not to. That won't stop some people, but it's just the way it is, right? So if you buy that property on a main road, and particularly if you buy it in a stock-starved market where you buy it, you have to pay a bit more than you probably would normally have to pay for it because there's FOMO driving the market, et cetera, et cetera. When you go to sell that property, you have to pick another stock-starved market, another seller's market to sell it, because you will not have the luxury of being able to find a buyer in all markets, in all market conditions. And that's a really important thing, to not get trapped into a property. And so if you buy a dog, if you buy something next to a service station, right, on a main road, on a triangular block of land where the house is higher than the garden and there's no level garden, I mean, in a gully that floods and is damp, like these sorts of properties you cannot fix, or you're buying in it and it's basically built against a cliff and you got no sun in the afternoon. These really highly negative things that you cannot fix in a property that people will end up compromising on because they think, oh, that's the only way into the market. There's always another way, and the other way is a bit that you might not want. It might be going to another suburb that's less expensive, but you can buy a better house, a better asset in that suburb. That's always going to do you better financially than buying the crappiest house in a good suburb. It might be buying a townhouse instead of a house. It might be an apartment. Just be very careful with scarcity but there are other options. And I think that's the thing, that people like get so desperate they buy something that nobody else would touch with a barge pole in a slow market. That's really where you get yourself stuck.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen quite a few of those in recent times. And the trouble is that you don't necessarily on day one realize the dog is the dog, right? And I was going to say, it's worth just thinking through some of the characteristics of dogs. Location is on the main road. You've touched on that. Quality of construction, which is something to worry about too. And also things like direction, sun, those sorts of things.
Yes,
they actually
aspect,
are pretty. Aspect is pretty important, and also development plans, right? So the thing that I find shocking, really shocking, is that so many people don't actually ask the question about what could be built next door or behind or over the other side of the road, right? And at the moment, with the changes of planning rules that are being spoken about, you could well be in an area where suddenly you're going to be surrounded by high-rise, 4-6 stories or something. And so the whole tenor of the place that you're in could change. And unless you've got the ability to be able to actually build on your plot and convert it into something else, you're going to actually find that the value of your property goes down because the nature of the suburb changes. And of all the things that I've seen in the last few months, I actually think the changing suburbs is actually one of the most critical things that people haven't got their head around.
When you say the changing suburbs, are you talking about the impetus that the federal government is putting on state governments to put on councils to rezone and create more opportunity for sort of medium and in some cases high density development?
I'm talking about that, exactly right. And some of the areas around Melbourne were classics, right? So I did some work last year looking specifically at some of the middle suburban areas in Melbourne where they changed the planning regs. Also did some work in Western Australia where they reduced the plot size to 200 squares from 400 or 600, right? And people who'd bought on one set of assumptions suddenly found that the ground shifted under them. And as a result of that, their property dropped in value considerably, not because their own property changed, but because the context of their property changed.
Yes. And look, there's been situations certainly in my neck of the woods where, say, there's a corridor along Parramatta Road, which is the main road, that was rezoned for, I think, 6-story high apartments. And of course, that meant that a sort of a block back in previously suburban streets now have, blocks of apartments over their back fence, which they never in a million years anticipated. So there are signs, like aerial maps are great. We, in Homebuyer Academy, we teach people the process of going through and doing due diligence and what to look for with this sort of warning signs. Because the thing is, if the council changes zoning and there's been no sort of murmur of it beforehand, you've got no heads up. So, but there are things to look for on a map. So one of the things when people talk to me about buying a new subdivision, I go, right, let's just do a very quick aerial. Let's see how much land is surrounding that is available for redevelopment. That's one example. Or in an infill area, let's just look at how many sawtooth roofs there are, and how and whether or not these old industrial buildings, have finished their highest and best use, and there's an opportunity to rezone those residential. What's been happening around that? There's clues. There are definitely clues of the sorts of areas that are earmarked, and you can actually go to council and have a look at their development control plans as well, and see what their plans are. So, there are ways you can go about checking this stuff out, but it's like doing a strata report on an apartment building, right? There's all this information out there, but do you know how to interpret it? Do you know what to do with that information when you get it? We get, I hear people that want to go and buy an apartment, they get a strata report, they tick a box, yes, I've got a strata report. Did you read it and understand it? Isn't that what my solicitor does? No. They think they've got it, so they're done. No, you are not done.
Interpret
You're buying a liability. You're buying a level of responsibility, and not just to yourself, but to actually, particularly in strata, you're actually buying into, depending on what state in terms of the terminology, but you're buying into an owners corporation if you're in New South Wales, and that brings obligations. So anyway, I can rant about that too. But I just don't think there is enough understanding of the due diligence that needs to be done. People don't take it seriously enough about buying property. They just think you just need to do a building pest inspection and get your contract reviewed, and that's it. Check your pre-approval. Yeah, I'm good to go. You are not. You are not good to go. There's a lot more to learn. And if you haven't actually made a huge mistake by doing that, then you're lucky.
Absolutely. And just to say, of course, that the council maps are actually available online in most parts of Australia. Right?
Here's a hack, though. Yeah. They might not be up to date, so call and talk to the duty planner.
Correct. Spot on. You took the words out of my mouth. However, Not all of them are actually current, and interestingly, of course, quite often they don't tell you the full story. But it's a good starting point. In fact, what I do when I do my one-on-one conversations, I will look at the planning and zoning, right? And there's a series of questions you ask. I'll look at the flooding, right? I'll look at the bushfire mapping. I'll look at the crime maps, right? And a few other things too. You know, where are the main roads? What are the plans for those main roads? All of those things, because there are so many questions. Now, a good solicitor should be doing some of that, but you can't rely on them from doing that, right?
No, you can't.
No.
And you're right. A good solicitor will look at it, you know, and you've also got to remember I'm talking about New South Wales here. New South Wales has a fairly high degree of vendor disclosure, and so does Victoria, Adelaide to a bit, South Australia. Tasmania and Queensland, for argument's sake, have almost bugger all vendor disclosure. So you are dealing with different levels of information, different sort of degrees of information that have been handed over, and then knowing what else you need to know is the next step, right? So if something's mandatory in New South Wales, why isn't it mandatory in Queensland? Well, obviously the Queensland legislators don't really care. And so therefore, do I still need to know about it? Well, yes, you do need to know about it. Like, for instance, you do need to know where the sewer line is under the property, particularly if you want to build a pool.
Absolutely.
Or if there's been an extension, maybe it's been built over the sewer line. Like, fancy not knowing that. But that is not a prescribed document in Queensland. It is in New South Wales, but even then you've got to know, well, how do I interpret it? What's the information in there, and what do I need to know? What more do I need to know? So that there is so much information that really and truly you don't want to be discovering the hard way. You know, and it might be that it's a clean bill of health, and that's fantastic, buy with confidence. But people are buying blind every single day. They've got no idea.
Well, I think I probably told you that in my experience, people spend more time online digging around, choosing their fridge rather than their next property in terms of getting to understand the information. And you think of the relative quantum of investment required. One other question which comes up often is, but I got a building survey from the vendor as part of the transaction, and the survey said everything was fine. So do I really need to go and do something more than that?
Yes, you do. Now, let me give you an example. Apart from the fact, the obvious, I don't know, who's paid for the building inspection? Would it be the owner? Are they trying to sell the house? Is it in their interest to make sure that that's a really rigorous report? There's a certain franchise of building inspectors in Sydney that they're all individual franchises, franchisors, I think it is, or franchisees, whatever. But anyway, and they use the same report format. And there's one particular fellow who shall remain nameless, but is shocking. And the agents love him. Far too many of them use him, which basically means, given the sheer amount of reports that he's doing, he doesn't have enough hours in the day to do that volume of reports to start. So you can just imagine the attention to detail. But we looked at one property where the agent offered a report done by him. I usually don't even look at it, but the client looked at the report. And so she sort of came back to me and I said, no, we'll get our fellow, who happens to be in the same franchise, so therefore the report came in the same format. Now, I didn't look at the first report. We just got ours. And he said to us, look, both bathrooms downstairs in this house, both of them, the waterproofing has failed, and it won't be long really before somebody basically puts a foot through the floor. Like they're in dire need of replacement. He went under the house. He had all his photographic evidence and showed, where basically the leaks were, et cetera, et cetera. So probably about 20 grand's worth of work, just remedial work, just to sort that out, right? When I out of curiosity, I thought, look, let me have a look and compare it to the other guy's report. And I sat there and I went through and line by line, evidence of termite activity. The first guy, no. Our guy, yes, here. Any mention of those leaks in the first report? Nothing. He didn't even go under the house. He's put that as a disclaimer that he couldn't get access. I've been in houses and I've had one of his reports in my hand and I've been standing on the manhole. on the hatch. And I've said, so did you check under the house? No, I couldn't get access. And I looked at my feet. I kid you not. I looked at my feet and went, what, you couldn't get through that? Should we see if we can open it? And I opened it with him in front of me. So the guy does this cursory look. I went through line by line. I took a copy. I put together a report to show the difference in the two reports, and I sent it to the franchisor, the real estate, what do you call it? The agency, the head of the agency. And I said, you guys are giving this away. It's actually marketing material, right? So all your disclaimers in the world won't cut it. You are falsely representing this property, and I really recommend that you stop using this guy. I also sent the same report to a lot of other agents that I know use him. They all still use him. And heaps of people buy properties on the basis relying on those reports.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because when I sold my property in Thirroul, I got a few agents to come through and give me a sort of a spiel, and it was very interesting because not all agents were behaving in the same way, but there was definitely a thematic about, well, you should get a survey done because it helps with the marketing, right? Yeah. It helps with the marketing, right? And so I actually got one done. And the guy was there about 45 minutes. Now, this was a big property, it's 5 bedrooms, 2 stories, a lot of land. And I read this thing afterwards thinking, well, I didn't have to pay much for it, but it certainly didn't. I mean, there were things I knew about the property that weren't in the report. Nothing serious, right? Because it was actually quite well maintained. But the point there was, if that's a case study for the quality of the report that actually is being used as part of that, quote, marketing campaign, that tells you something pretty important, right? It is not an appropriate instrument off which to base a decision. And I can't underscore that enough.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. I mean, look, I helped my parents sell their house at the end of last year, and, I did the same thing. I said, of course, get a building inspection. If the buyer's going to rely on it, great. That house needed underpinning in one corner. It had been the whole time, even when I was a kid. It wasn't even mentioned. I mean, obviously it wasn't going to fall over, but it's just not to even mention it. No. It's just, just ludicrous. So, yeah, I think that it's important to understand that, you're taking the responsibility. It's a bit like underquoting, right? Everyone's complaining in Australia about underquoting, that auction agents underquote. And yes, they do. Underquoting is part of the system, right? I can go on into why that is, but it is a fact. Buyers don't believe agents anyway. They always add a certain amount of money to what the agent's saying. So there's this whole sort of game that's being played. Agents underquote. But the individual buyers, if you're playing in a game, right, if you're playing in a market where the stakes are so high and you're the one as the buyer that's going to be carrying the can at some point, no one else, and who wants to go into battle thinking, oh, well, I'm going to sue someone if it doesn't work out anyway? Like, who wants to, right? But if you need, as buyers, you need, if you're a buyer, to take the purchase and the due diligence and the whole exercise seriously. Take responsibility for it. So this idea about, oh yeah, I've just ticked that box, I've got the strata report, didn't understand it, or sent off to the lawyer and all they did was comment on the levies. I've got my building and pest inspection, I got it from the agent, it was free, or only cost me $29, so that's good. It's not good. You have to take responsibility for what you need to know before buying that property, because you're the one stuck with it if it's all wrong. And you know what? With high interest rates and high purchasing costs, a lot of people don't have fat left in the budget to deal with problems if they should come up. So just as some sort of mitigation exercise, if for nothing else, just to save your buffer, do the proper due diligence.
Absolutely right. And it also gives you some leverage to negotiate, right? So if in fact there are issues that are surfaced, well, for example, when I bought this property, it was clear to me that the heating system was going to need some work. So that was one of the leverage points I used, and I actually was able to drive the price down. Yeah, absolutely.
Very
particularly in the UK, right?
Yes. Now, on that, here's the thing. This is an important thing. You can only use it to leverage the price if the market conditions support that, right? If it's a hot market and some other mug is prepared to go for that property and doesn't care, and they're not going to bother doing their due diligence, sometimes you have to walk away. And we've had to do that plenty of times. We know more, as obviously we're professional buyers agents and we've got clients and we know more than the other buyers. It's really annoying because in some ways you think, oh my God, my clients are disadvantaged because we know so much. But that's sort of weird thinking, isn't it? That's flawed thinking. They're not disadvantaged, they're totally advantaged. But the thing is, and we have to say to them, the problem is that person will probably pay more than you. But, let them, because we've discovered these reasons why you should not pay more, and so we have had to walk away from deals because we know more, some problems are insurmountable. They're total deal breakers, and others are things you can deal with, but at the right price. So you can't always negotiate, but what you can do is set your limit accordingly.
Absolutely. And with all of those things, there is a point at which you can find some wriggle room. But as you say, if there are other people willing to pay more, you have to be prepared to walk away. And I think being prepared to walk away is, on one hand, the toughest thing to do, particularly if you fall in love with a place, because it goes back to this emotional thing that you get involved in. It's not just a financial transaction, right? But on some occasions, walking away is actually the only thing to do, but it's the hardest thing in the world to do. And by the way, that's another reason why people come to auction, right? And why auctions are often used, because you have less chance to sort of react and think about it, right? And you get swept up. So it's quite often people actually repent at their leisure, having bid more than they were going to at an auction. So another object lesson there too. Very
true. Auctions are one of my favorite topics, but when it comes to walking away and it being one of the hardest things to do, one of the other reasons is because of sunk cost bias. So we're talking about behavioural biases earlier. With sunk cost, particularly if you have gone down the path of doing all the due diligence that I recommend you do, when we do it with our clients, for instance, we even find it ourselves. We've done all this work and now we've uncovered a deal breaker. You have to be mindful of that pool, that sunk cost bias pool that makes you want to just go there anyway because you've invested all that time and money already, and be very conscious of that so you can resist that tug. And that's one of the things that does make walking away so hard.
Yeah, it does. And of course, I've heard a number of people say, but I've spent, X $1,000 on this report, that report, another report, and I've now got to the point where I can't progress. So that's wasted money. No, it's not wasted money. It was essential money.
Insurance policy.
Exactly. And again, you took the word out of my mouth. It is actually insurance to make sure that you don't end up with a dog, right? Because if you do end up with a property that has significant issues attached to it, they are going to come home to roost. They are going to actually cost you a lot of money. And quite often, the remedial work that you will be required to do would more than outweigh any possible upside you might ever get from the property. And so that's the right lens to put on it. So this due diligence stuff, you can't not do it, but I'm afraid a lot of people decide to just buy anyway, and that's a real problem.
Well, that's why we've got a whole module dedicated to it in our course at Your First Home Buyer Guide, and that's because both Megan, who's my business partner there, and she's a buyer's agent in Brisbane, and we have basically combined our professional due diligence processes and teach how to go through and everything you need to look for and where to get the information from. And even then, even with our businesses, sometimes there's a point where you think, okay, I would like to answer that question, but I can't get the answer. Sometimes you cannot get the information. So then a decision has to be made, well, what's the risk? Is that something that we're prepared to take or something that we're not prepared to take? Is it a deal breaker, or is it we'll adjust the price, or we'll just take it as being a very low probability? And what are the consequences if we do that? And it does come to be. So, there are ways to approach, quite a systematic way to approach doing the due diligence and properly evaluating a property. And you can turn this stuff around really quickly if you know what you're doing. And it gives a huge peace of mind.
Absolutely. But again, it's got to go through the process, right? And that's, you need the checklist.
Not the easy way.
No.
Got to go the hard way, unfortunately.
Exactly. Yes. The one with briars and all sorts of other potholes and things, but actually...
The goat track.
Exactly. Now,
my girlfriend and I talk about this. We go, oh, why is it in life other people are just going in the super highway, zoom, zoom, zoom? We're taking the goat track. But anyway.
Yeah, it's funny about life, isn't it? I'm afraid that I seem to spend a lot of time on by roads and over mountains and under hills and all sorts of weird things. But there you go. That's another story. Now, a question that I got from a couple of people before the show, knowing that you've got a very focused view of buyer's agent, was when should you use a buyer's agent? Should you use a buyer's agent? And what can you expect from a buyer's agent?
So I think, contrary to what a lot of buyer's agents will say, you should always use a buyer's agent. I don't think that's correct. I think if you can find a local specialist who is very experienced, and when I'm talking very experienced, ideally a good 10 years. I mean, if they work in a business with other people that have got long history or long experience in the industry, fine. And, they can have shorter experience themselves as long as they all work as a team. But, you need somebody who's got at least 10 years experience there mentoring them or them themselves. But that's fine. You can have one experience 10 times. You can have 10 cumulative years of experience, right? So you want somebody who's gone through hot markets and soft markets, so they understand the difference. We're talking earlier about types of properties that will sell well in a slow market, so they can guide you on what to avoid in a hot market, all that sort of stuff. But you're also going to have someone that cares enough to be able to tell you when to walk away, and who will do and can demonstrate for you their robust due diligence and pricing processes. So if you can find a local specialist who intimately knows that market and ticks all those boxes, then yes, you will get extraordinary value out of working with a buyer's agent. If, however, you're dealing with somebody who's, less experienced, very good at marketing spin, telling you what you want to hear, telling you property always goes up in value, basically, they're very inexperienced, very confident, not a local specialist, particularly those fly in, fly out buyer's agents or buy anywhere based on data. You run a mile. So I would just say, if somebody's not a local specialist, don't engage them. Go and become one yourself. And if a local specialist doesn't exist in the area in which you want to buy, then you really need to go and become a local specialist yourself. And there are, I think that using a great buyer's agent, I can tell you there's so many case studies in my business. I know we have saved our clients hundreds of thousands of dollars, not just in negotiating, but in bullets dodged, But I do know, and I know other buyer's agents who I trust would be the same with their clients. But unfortunately, there's a lot that give away. Agents will often laugh about new buyer's agents behind their backs. You don't want to be you don't want to hire the type of buyer's agent that gets laughed at. And you don't want to hire the type of buyer's agent that really and truly you could have done better yourself. And I see all the time evidence of deals where honestly the client would have done better if they were left to their own devices. And that's criminal.
Absolutely. And there isn't any sort of formal regulatory framework, is there, for buyer agents at the moment?
Well, as you're probably aware, I started a mentoring program the end of last year or the beginning of this year, really. Because there isn't. There isn't. Okay. So every buyer's agent in Australia has to have a real estate license. But the problem is that the regulations in each state vary in terms of experience level and also what you need to run your own business. So in New South Wales, Victoria and ACT, at least a buyer's agent has to have their license and some industry experience before they can run their own business. Whereas everywhere else, they don't. And Queensland's even worse because they only have to do one subject of a diploma on top of their license before they qualify to open their own office. So you get people with zero experience. They might have a real estate license, and some of those have been acquired through RTOs that aren't very robust, shall we say, and so very quickly acquired licenses. And sometimes in those other states where it's more difficult to get a license, they set up an office. There's certain people that encourage people to do this, go and set up an office in Queensland and go and get it up there because it's quicker and cheaper and easier, and then they get mutual recognition. So this is another thing. Ask the buyer's agent you're thinking about using, when did they get their license? How did they get their license? Where did they get their license? So that's quite important, because you think if they're doing a backdoor Benny, then you think, what sort of person is this, for starters? So they have to have a license. But let me tell you, there are no core subjects in that license that relate to being a buyer's agent. There's a handful of electives. There are heck more subjects in there about being a sales agent and property manager, because that's really what the course is designed for. It's not designed to teach you how to be a buyer's agent, which means there is nothing in there that teaches due diligence. Nothing, even in the electives. So anybody doing a license, and particularly if they've got no experience, they wouldn't even know what they need to look for. And so that's horrific. And that's what you've got to be super careful of when you engage a buyer's agent.
Absolutely. Do your own due diligence.
Yeah.
And there are some obvious questions. You've outlined some of them. How well do they know the local area, those sorts of things. Also, when they start talking about comparatives, push them quite hard, because I find that quite often the comparables aren't actually necessarily as coherent as they should be.
Well, here's the thing. Both Pricefinder and CoreLogic, which are databases that, most buyers agents and real estate agents subscribe to, I do, you can push a button on both of them and get an AVM, so an automated valuation model, right? And they can spit out an appraisal. Now, a sales agent will do that, right? And the consequences for a sales agent are nowhere near as high. Yes, of course, they're advising a potential vendor on what to expect for their home. But at the end of the day, if they market it well, the market's going to decide what the price is, right? And the vendor can still decide whether they will or won't sell at a certain price. Whereas a buyer who engages a buyer's agent, and that buyer's agent presses a button on RP Data and then says, there you go, that's what you should pay for the property. Well, that's flat out, in my view, wrong, right? Because there's a lot of analysis that needs to go into pricing, a pricing recommendation. And I'd love it if I could just press a button, let me tell you, because it would save hours and hours and hours of time. And maybe, we'll get to a point where AI will help us out here. But currently, it's not. Currently, that local expertise needs to be applied to know whether that property that's sold around the corner is actually comparable or not, and also were there mitigating circumstances surrounding the sale that meant that it sold for a high price or a low price or whatever. And this is a sort of market intel you're not going to get through AI, not yet anyway, and you're certainly not going to get it through CoreLogic or Pricefinder. And so anyone is that's why I say ask them what their processes are, for due diligence and for price research, because you'd want to see there's an element of insight that they're bringing to the table that really helps you make good decisions.
Absolutely right. And the point there is that so often, the BS starts with the comparisons, right? Because if you actually start going down the wrong road, you then make a whole bunch of decisions, which are then incorrect decisions based on that information that you've got, which isn't necessarily right to start with. So it's really, really, really important to understand the basis on which those comparables are actually being constructed. And in my own situation, when I sold my property last year, I formed my own view based on my own research, because I had a much broader base of analysis. But I went down to looking at the construction and numbers of rooms in the properties in the area, and I came up with a completely different set of comparables to the one that the main agents, which they pushed a button and pulled the stuff off Domain or whatever, right, and said, there you go. I said, well, actually, that's not the full story. What about this? What about this, right? It shows you've got to be so careful with this, because, of course, it is the point of departure.
Well, one of the things that we do as part of our process is we look at the floor plans and we compare the total living area. So, and depending on the types of property, we might compare other bedroom sizes, main bedroom sizes, et cetera, as well. But certainly if we add in all the actual common spaces within the house, because floor plans can be very misleading as well. You can look at a floor plan, it looks like a big house, and then you can look at another one, looks like a small house, and you sit there and actually work out the dimensions, and it's the reverse. It's just optical illusions, really. And that's really, really telling because, you have properties with much, much bigger living areas, much, much smaller living areas. And of course, the ones with the bigger living areas are going to sell better than the ones with smaller living areas. It's a small thing, but, it's quite meaningful.
Absolutely. Well, it goes back to, again, getting granular and understanding what's really, really going on. Again, I just am amazed at some of the high levels. Now, somebody asked a question in the chat a little while ago, what's the quantum of fees you're talking about for a buyer's agent? I mean, is it a fixed fee or is it a proportion of the price? How does that work?
I've actually got a blog on my website that sort of explains, it's on gooddeeds.com.au. If someone wants to go on the blog and look up fees, and there's a blog in there that explains the different ways in which buyer's agents' fees are put together. There's two main ways. There's a fixed fee, and then there's a percentage fee, percentage of the purchase price. Personally, I find that counterintuitive. I think that a buyer's agent should be able to quote a fixed fee that is not based on a percentage, because that's just like an application of a sales agent's pricing. And then it's with sales agents, your fee goes up as they get more money for the house or the property, whereas a buyer's agent, you shouldn't be charging your client more if they pay more. So it's a bit counterintuitive. But a fixed fee is certainly how we charge. It will vary, and different areas have different prices. Like I often hear people talk about the fee being $15,000. Well, I can tell you right now that our lowest fee is a lot more than $15,000, but also we're in Sydney and we're also very much a bespoke agency. You want to be careful that they're not too cheap, because if they're too cheap, it's a commercial reality that you're going to be you're going to number and they're going to want to churn you pretty quickly because they're a volume business. So this is the thing with buyer's agents. It's very labor intensive at the moment. As I said, maybe AI will kick in and provide some help here. But the reality is that, these buyer's agents that charge smaller fees, so like a 12 grand or 15 grand fee, for instance, they're probably pushing a button on RP Data to give you pricing advice. You know what I mean? There's swings and roundabouts and all this price you pay, I guess, for cheaper fees. There's also two main types of services. There's the full search, where a buyer's agent would, take your brief and go out there looking for properties, come up with options for you, et cetera, do the evaluation of those properties. And then there's a service which is an evaluate, negotiate for an individual property. So obviously that's going to be a lesser fee. You take that along and say, right, I really want to buy this property. Can you help me get it? Can you help me work out if there's anything wrong with it? What's it worth? Negotiate, et cetera, then that will be a lesser fee than for a full search. And in many cases, it's around about half the price, maybe a third to a half the price of what a full search might be.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you for that. Now, as we come towards the end of the show, you mentioned that there was a video coming out quite soon with some important points. Did you want to just mention that briefly?
Oh, well, actually, it's not. We were talking earlier offline before we started, everyone, and that was about property investors who might be feeling uncomfortable because obviously interest rates are rising and they're thinking, should I be selling my property or not? And, because of course the rents they're rising a lot, but they're not rising at the same rate. The interest rates have risen. And so actually in 2021, I think I put this together, which was a video presentation for clients who were thinking at that point of time of cashing out of their investment properties, because they were thinking, wow, I've just had this great gain and, maybe now's the time to exit. And I thought, look, that's actually not a great reason to exit the market necessarily. And likewise now, if interest rates are rising and you're feeling the pinch, it might not be a great time to exit the market. It might be worth holding on and sticking to your guns. So I came up with a framework, I guess, to help people work out whether they should be considering selling, and if so, when, and what are the things you need to think through. So I'll quickly talk you through those as 7 points. I've just got them here to remind myself, and I put them together in a video, which you can buy for $39. It's on my website under the resources tab, which is veronicamorgan.com.au. So if you want to, you can get this video, but I'll just give it to you now if you want the short version. First one is market conditions. So you got to understand where we are in the cycle and why periods of price growth are rarely one-off. Secondly, you got to think, what was your plan when you bought the property versus what your plans are now? Are you on or off track, and how do you measure performance? Thirdly, what's the caliber of the asset? As I spoke before about the how good is that asset? Put simply, is it worth keeping, and how do you work out whether it is or not? Fourth is, what will you do with the money if you do sell, and have you considered the tax implications? Those things to think about. The fifth thing is, do you have the right advisors? So accountant, financial planner, conveyancer, property advisor, those sorts of people. Do you have them? I probably could add in mortgage broker. 6, timing a sale and what's involved in the listing process and how long it takes to get on the market. And finally, how do you choose a sales agent? So that I've got a video that really covers all of those 7 points and helps you work out whether you should consider selling or not. And if you do, what you need to do next, and thinking about the timing. So there you go.
Excellent. And that was totally appropriate, because that was the final thematic that I wanted to touch on, because I had quite a few people asking about property investing. Should I get out? What are the things I need to think about? And that was a very, 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 very potent list of things to think about. So I appreciate that. Now, I always try and summarize all the things you do, and it's a very long list, right? But basically, we've got Elephant in the Room podcast, we've got the first time buyers, we've got the buyer agent stuff, and a bunch of other stuff that you're doing as well. So go and look at Veronica's website. It's all there, isn't it?
Everything is on veronicamorgan.com.au. I finally, about a year ago, got my pulled my finger out and got the whole website updated. So it's all there, including my rant video. So if you want to, you can scroll through and find the chocolate covered dog food in there if you want to as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I do recommend that as a great resource. And the Elephant in the Room podcast too, is a very, very good additional source of stuff. There's so much information that you could actually get hold of. It would really make a big improvement in making those decisions. So, well, Veronica, I want to say thank you so much for spending some of your evening with us. Great conversation as always. It's the time which just whizzes by when you and I end up talking about property, right?
Aren't we sad?
Well, sad, or maybe it's just enjoy. But I think both you and I have a passion about helping people make better decisions, because ultimately that's what this is all about.
100%. And you know what? We're lucky we love what we do, really. But yeah, that is my whole reason for living, really, is to help people make better property decisions. I do have other things that I like doing, but it's so important. You get it right and life can be good. Life can be really good. You get it wrong, it's awful. So I just want to help people get it right.
Absolutely. And the point is, there is no simple formulation, but there are some critical things that you can do to give yourself a much better chance of getting it right. In the current environment with all the uncertainties, it's probably never been more important than now to use some of this experience and knowledge to make better decisions.
I would highly recommend, even just the free mini course, if people are thinking about how to price a property. We're talking about pressing a button on RP Data or Price Finder. And it's tempting even for you as when you're looking at buying to go and press those buttons to get those AVMs. But there's a little free course which you can find on Home Buyer Academy, or you can find on my website, which is How to Price a Property. And so I talk about what not to do. That will actually teach you how to do it.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much, Veronica. Really appreciated your time tonight, and I'm sure we'll pick up the conversation down the track as we go around the houses over the next few months, literally. And
absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm going to take you offline now and close the show. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, folks, well, that's it. Another 1.5 hours shot by. And just to tell you that next week, Tony LaCantra is coming on. He's going to give us the latest and greatest in terms of his view of the investment markets and what's going on there. And just to say that the dogs are still, well, asleep. They clearly weren't taking full attention of what was going on the podcast, but nevertheless, you might have heard them grunt a few times. It wasn't me, it was the dogs. Anyway, thank you very much. Take care. Have a good week, and look forward to seeing you live next Tuesday. And of course, I'm putting out shows daily on the other days in the week. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.